Eleanor Winslow Aldridge did not scream. She did not weep. She did not reach for the bell to summon anyone at all. She sat very straight at the foot of the long table at Aldridge Hall, in the chair that had been hers for 6 years, and she turned her mother's garnet ring once around her finger, and she said nothing while the room went on laughing without her. Then she stood. She gathered the ring's small weight into her palm, as if closing a hand over a coal, and she walked out of her own dining room with her chin level and her back straight past 40 guests who had just watched her husband seat another man's wife at his right hand and call it nothing at all. By the time the candles burned down that night, Eleanor would have made a decision that would take the better part of 2 years to finish making itself known. Julian Aldridge would spend that same 2 years learning the difference between a woman who is useful and a woman who is necessary, and by the time he understood it, it would no longer be his to have. The summer of 1817 had come to Wiltshire the way it always did, green and unhurried, indifferent to the households it passed through. It found Aldridge Hall much as it had found it every June for 6 years, the hay half in, the accounts half balanced, the roof of the west wing patched again rather than properly redone, and Eleanor Aldridge awake before the rest of the house, going over figures in a ledger no one but her had opened since her wedding. She had married Julian at 19, for reasons that had seemed, at the time, indistinguishable from love. He had been handsome in the particular careless way of men who had never had to notice their own faces, heir to a hall that wanted money, and a name that wanted an heir. And she had brought both a dowry and a habit of getting difficult things done quietly. It had seemed, for a year or two, like a fair trade. Then his father died, and the debts came out from under the furniture like damp, and Julian had gone still in a way he never fully came back from. He did not become cruel. That would have been simpler. He became careful and correct, and absent in all the ways that did not show on a Sunday. He thanked her for the accounts the way a man thanks a competent clerk. He stopped asking how she had managed something and started merely noting that it was managed. She learned to read his silences the way she read weather, and she built, without ever deciding to, an entire second self that ran the dairy and the tenant rents and the seed order and the roof repairs, and asked for nothing in return but to be seen doing it. She was not seen doing it. That was the particular arithmetic of the 6 years. The work compounded, and the noticing did not. It was Mrs. Agatha Pruitt, her late mother's cousin, and the nearest thing Eleanor had to a mother left living, who first said the name Rain in her hearing. Agatha ran her household 2 parishes over, with the efficiency of a woman who had buried 2 husbands and outlasted both their debts, and she did not traffic in gossip so much as intelligence. "Vivienne Rain is come to stay at Combe Park for the summer," Agatha said, over tea Eleanor had not asked for, and did not want but drank anyway, because Agatha poured it whether one wanted it or not. Husband off in the city minding his money, as such men do. "She has taken a very particular interest in your Julian's harvest committee." "He needs the committee," Eleanor said. "The mortgage wants clearing. He needs a wife who is not embarrassed to be seen with him in daylight," Agatha said, "and he has one, and does not appear to know it." She looked at Eleanor over the rim of her cup, the way she had looked at her since Eleanor was 11 and newly motherless and pretending very hard not to be. "Your mother used to say the truth doesn't need help, it only needs time. I have always thought that was patience dressed up as comfort, but I have not yet known it to be wrong." Eleanor did not answer that. She finished the roof estimates instead, and the seed order, and the letter to the bank about the autumn note, and she told herself the way she had told herself for 6 years, that the work was the marriage, and the marriage was the work, and there was no need to go looking for the difference between them. She would not have to go looking. By the end of that August, the difference would come and sit down at her own table, in a gown finer than anything in Eleanor's press, and smile at her the whole length of the meal. The dinner was Julian's idea, though he told the county it was to celebrate the mortgage's first reduction, a thing Eleanor herself had achieved through 11 months of unglamorous arithmetic. He had invited 40 guests. He had ordered the good china brought down. And when Eleanor came downstairs in her one good gown, her mother's ring turned careful and small on her finger, she found the seat beside her husband already occupied. Mrs. Vivian Rain was, Eleanor would think later, exactly the kind of beautiful that costs money to maintain, and looks effortless regardless. She had dark hair dressed high, and a laugh that arrived on cue, and a way of touching a man's sleeve for exactly as long as propriety allowed, and not 1 second more. She sat in Eleanor's chair at Julian's right hand, and when Eleanor reached the table, Julian rose only halfway, said, "There you are," as if she were a parcel that had been delayed, and gestured her to a seat 3 places down, beside the vicar's deaf uncle. Eleanor did not say anything. She sat where she was put. She ate what was served. She answered when spoken to, which was seldom, because the table's attention ran the other way, down toward the end where Vivienne Rain was telling a story about a house party in Bath, with her whole face, laughing at her own jokes half a beat before anyone else could. It was after the second course, when the room had loosened with wine, that Eleanor rose to see about the pudding, and passed close by the drawing-room door, which had been left ajar, and heard her own name in her husband's mouth. "Eleanor?" Julian was saying low, to a red-faced man she placed vaguely as a friend of Vivienne's husband. "She keeps the ledgers. That's what she's for. A man wants someone sensible to run the place while he attends to the parts that actually require charm." The red-faced man laughed, not unkindly, the way men laugh at a joke they have not examined. "Lucky you've got charm to spare, then. One does what one can," Julian said, and there was a smile in his voice Eleanor had not heard directed at her in longer than she wanted to count. She did not go in. She did not make a sound. She stood in the passage with the pudding forgotten in her hands, and let the sentence finish arriving in full, the way a bill arrives in full even when you have already guessed the sum. She keeps the ledgers. That's what she's for. 6 years, and that was the whole of the accounting. Not a wife, not a partner, not a woman he had once written letters to across 2 counties. A tool. Useful, kept because kept things are convenient, and returned to their drawer when convenience required someone brighter at hand. She set the pudding down on the passage table with both hands, carefully the way one sets down something that might otherwise be thrown. Then she went back into the dining room, sat in her seat beside the vicar's deaf uncle, and finished the meal. She gave herself 10 minutes for it, later, alone in the small sitting room that had been her mother's, and was, by some old habit of the house, still called Eleanor's room, though nothing in it had changed. She had learnt the trick of the 10 minutes at 17. The week her own mother died, when her father had needed her steady, and there had been no time to fall apart properly, and she had discovered, almost by accident, that grief obeyed a clock if you were firm enough with it. She set her mother's ring on the table where she could watch it. She counted the minutes by the mantel clock. She allowed herself, in that quarter hour, to feel exactly as small and as unwanted as the sentence had made her, and then, when the clock's hand came round, She put the feeling away in the drawer at the back of her mind where such things went. And she picked the ring back up, and she began, instead, to think. She was 23 years old. She had brought £6,000 to this marriage in trust from her father, untouched, because her father, a solicitor with a solicitor's caution, had settled it so that no husband's creditor could reach it. She knew the estate's accounts better than the man who owned the estate. She knew every tenant by name and every field by yield. She had, in 6 years, made herself indispensable to a household that had just told her, in a doorway, over pudding, that indispensable and beloved were not the same word. That, she decided, sitting very still with the ring warm again in her palm, was the whole of the lesson, and she did not intend to need it taught to her twice. She did not confront Julian that night, nor the next morning, nor the morning after that. She went instead to Combe Park 2 days later, in the plain gig she drove herself, because she had never seen the sense in waiting for a groom, and she sat in Agatha Pruitt's small parlour and told her, without embellishment, what she had heard in the doorway. Agatha did not gasp. She poured more tea. "Well," she said, "now you know the price of him. Most women go their whole lives without learning it in words that plain." She studied Eleanor over the rim of her cup, the same look she had given her at 11, at 17, at 19 on her wedding day. "What will you do with it?" "I don't know yet," Eleanor said, and found, saying it, that it was true. And that not knowing yet felt less like weakness than it once would have. "But I am done being kept in a drawer." Agatha nodded, once, as if a verdict had been delivered, and she agreed with the finding. "Then you'll want to start with the harvest ledgers," she said. A woman who means to be seen had better have something worth seeing. The blocked culvert under the North Fields had been someone's problem for entirely too long by the time Eleanor decided it would be hers. It sat below Hollow Mead, the 40 acres Aldridge Hall let to a tenant farmer named Thomas Reed, and every wet spring for 3 years it had backed up and drowned the lower third of his wheat before anyone above him took it seriously enough to dig. Reed had written to Julian twice. Julian had written back once, briefly, to say the matter would be looked into when funds allowed, a sentence Eleanor had typed out herself, at his dictation, and had recognised even then as the sound of a decision being postponed rather than made. She went to see the culvert herself on a Tuesday, in boots rather than slippers, with Thomas Reed walking beside her in the particular silence of a man who does not expect to be listened to and has decided not to waste breath proving it. "Nothing complicated about it, ma'am," he said finally, when she crouched at the bank and asked him to show her exactly where the water backed. Culverts silted. Been silted 3 year, wants clearing and relining, and a new sluice gate above it so it don't happen again come the next wet spring. £18 for the labour, near enough, 30 more for stone and the gate itself. £48, Eleanor said, against how much crop lost each year it isn't done. Reed looked at her sideways, as if the question itself were unusual, which she understood, standing there. It likely was. Near £60 of wheat drowned last spring alone, ma'am. Might have been 80, but for a dry June saving what was left. She did the arithmetic where she stood, aloud, because she had learned that saying numbers aloud made men trust them more than the same numbers written down. £48 spent once against £60 lost yearly, every year, for as long as the culvert stayed silted. It was not clever. It was not even difficult. It was the kind of sum any competent person could have done 3 years ago, and no one had, because no one with the authority to spend £48 had thought Thomas Reed's flooded wheat worth 40 minutes of their attention. "I'll have the money to you by Friday," Eleanor said. "And I'll want the gate built to outlast me, Mr. Reed, not merely outlast this spring." Reed did not smile. She would learn over the following months that he smiled perhaps twice a year, and both times were for his children, but something in his face unlocked half a degree, the particular loosening of a man deciding, provisionally, that a person might be worth his trust after all. "I'll build it right then," he said. "Ma'am." She paid for it from her own pin money, supplemented without telling anyone, by the sale of a pair of earrings she had never especially liked. The gate went in over 9 days in July. It held through the first hard rain in August, and Hollowmead's lower third, which had drowned 3 years running, stood green and dry, and full of wheat that would come September be worth a good deal more than £48. Word of a flooded field saved travels slowly through a county, and then all at once, the way water itself moves, pooling unseen for a long time, and then finding, all in a rush, the one channel that lets it run downhill to everywhere at once. By the end of August, 2 more tenants had come to Eleanor directly, rather than to Julian, one about a barn roof, and one about a boundary hedge, and both times she had listened, done the sums aloud, and found the money somewhere that was not the estate's already strained account. Julian noticed the barn roof before he noticed anything else, because it was new slate and visible from the drive. "Did you see to that?" he asked her one evening, over a dinner with no guests, in a voice that was not quite surprised, and not quite anything else either. "I did," Eleanor said. "Huh," he said, and there was for perhaps 1 second something in his face that had not been there in a long while, not warmth exactly, but the ghost of an old attention, the ancestor of a compliment he did not quite know how to finish giving. Then he looked back down at his plate, and the moment closed over like water over a stone, and he did not mention it again. It was around that same week that Vivienne Rain, calling at Aldridge Hall on some pretext about a charity subscription, mentioned to Julian, within Eleanor's hearing, but not quite to her, that she understood there was an old debt of the Winslow families, something to do with Eleanor's father's practice, some client's unpaid fee, that a diligent solicitor might still recover, if only someone thought to look into the old papers. She said it lightly, over tea, the way one mentions the weather. Julian said he had never heard of any such debt. Vivienne said, smiling, that she was certain it was nothing, and turned the conversation to the subscription instead. Eleanor said nothing at the time. But she wrote the sentence down that night, in the private ledger she had begun keeping in June, under a heading that said only, "Vivienne Rain. Old debt?" Watch. She did not yet know what it meant. She had learned, however, that a sentence which arrived that lightly, aimed that precisely, was never actually about the weather. The corn merchant's man came to Aldridge Hall in the 2nd week of September, expecting to deal with Julian, and found Eleanor waiting for him in the estate office instead, the harvest ledgers open on the desk between them. "Mr. Aldridge generally leaves the grain contract to me," she said, which was true only since June, and true enough now that it did not require further explanation. "You've offered 9 shillings the bushel. Last year's contract, under the same merchant, was 11. Prices have softened, ma'am," the man said, with the particular smoothness of someone who has said the sentence before and expects it to work again. "They have not softened in Devizes," Eleanor said, "where the same firm is paying 10 and 6. I have the receipt of a neighbouring sale here, if you'd like to see it." She had, in fact, ridden to Devizes herself the week before to obtain it, a fact she did not offer, and he did not ask. He looked at the paper for longer than its contents required, the look of a man recalculating not the price but the woman across from him, and then he named 10 and 4, and she counted with 10 and 6 to match Devizes exactly, and he took it, because there was nowhere left for him to stand. It was £40 more than Julian would have secured, and Julian, when told, said only, "Well done," in a tone that suggested he did not entirely know what to do with the sentence once he had said it, as though praise were a coat he had not worn in some years and had forgotten how to fasten. The county, meanwhile, had begun to speak of Eleanor Aldridge in a register it had not used before. It was Agatha who reported it, with evident satisfaction, over tea. "Mrs. Farrow says you're the reason Aldridge tenants aren't leaving for better land elsewhere. Says it plain, in company. And old Sir Walter Combe told me at the assembly you'd have made a better magistrate than half the men who sit the bench." She paused. "There's more. I had it from my own housekeeper, whose sister is laundry maid at Aldridge Hall. Your husband's father, before the debts came out, before he died, there was talk, years back, of a partner who ruined him. A man Julian's father trusted with the whole of the estate's capital, who took it to some scheme in the city and lost every shilling of it, and left the old man to explain it to his tenants himself, one by one, at the door." Agatha's voice was flat, the voice she used for facts rather than opinions. Julian was 19. He watched it happen. I have always thought that was where the coldness in him started, not cruelty, mind, just a boy deciding, watching his father ruined by trusting the wrong person, that he would never again let sentiment anywhere near his money. Doesn't excuse him, but it explains a good deal of why a man who married a clever woman has spent 6 years treating her cleverness like a tool in a drawer, rather than a gift in his hand. Eleanor turned her mother's ring once around her finger, the way she did when she was filing something away to be examined later, in the 10 minutes, or in some quieter hour still to come. "That does not make what he said to that man in the doorway kinder," she said. "No," Agatha agreed. "It only makes it explainable. Explainable and forgivable are different countries, and I notice you have not yet been asked to travel to the second one." Eleanor drove home that evening with the reins loose in her hands, and the September light going long and gold across the stubble fields, and she thought, not for the first time, that a man's fear was not her responsibility to manage, however well she now understood its shape. She thought too of Vivienne Rain's phaeton in Marrowfield, in broad daylight, with no discretion at all, and understood, with the particular clarity that comes only once real evidence has finally caught up to a long-held suspicion, that the summer's small humiliation had not ended. It had only been gathering itself for something larger. It came, as such things nearly always did in that part of the world, at the county assembly at Michaelmas, in front of everyone she knew. The Michaelmas assembly at the Marrowfield Rooms was the one occasion each year at which the whole of the county's gentry, and a fair portion of its trade, agreed to occupy the same 3 rooms at the same time, and Eleanor had attended every year of her marriage in the same grey silk, remade twice, because a new gown had never once seemed as urgent as a new sluice gate. She was standing near the refreshment table with Agatha, watching the dancing without particular longing, when Julian led Vivienne Rain onto the floor for the second time that evening, a thing that was, strictly, permitted, and strictly, in that room, understood by everyone present to mean a great deal, more than permission covered. The room's attention followed them the way attention follows a spill, not loudly, but completely. Eleanor watched her husband's hand at Vivienne Rain's waist, and Vivienne's laugh tipped back and offered to the whole room like a coin thrown for effect, and she felt something in her chest go very quiet and very cold, the particular stillness of a woman doing arithmetic she has already, somewhere beneath the counting, finished doing. It was Gideon Rain who found her a moment later, having crossed the room with the unhurried directness of a man used to being given space rather than asking for it. She had met him only once before, briefly, at a dinner in July, and remembered chiefly that he had asked her 3 intelligent questions about drainage, and had listened to all 3 answers as though they mattered. He was perhaps 40, broad through the shoulder, in the manner of a man who had done physical work at some point in his life, and had not entirely lost the habit. With a fortune from shipping and banking interests in the city, that was, by every account she had heard, so large as to have become a kind of local weather system of its own. He did not look at the dance floor. He looked instead at Eleanor, with an expression she recognised because she had worn it herself for 6 years, the particular composure of someone standing very still atop something that has just cracked. "Mrs. Aldridge," he said, "I understand you saved a man named Reed's whole crop of wheat this summer for the cost of a sluice gate and 9 days' labour." It was such an unexpected sentence, in that room, on that evening, that Eleanor very nearly laughed. "I did," she said. "I find," Gideon Rain said, still not looking at the dance floor, though everyone else in the room could not seem to look anywhere else, that I would rather discuss sluice gates than watch whatever it is we are both currently watching. Will you walk with me as far as the window? The dancing does not require an audience quite this attentive." Eleanor set down her cup. "I would like that very much," she said, and did not look at Julian either, though she was aware, with the whole surface of her skin, that for the first time in longer than she could remember, he was looking at her. They reached the tall window at the room's far end, where the candlelight thinned and the glass gave back a version of the assembly, gone soft and doubled, and Gideon Rain stood beside her for a long moment without speaking, watching the reflection rather than the room itself. "My wife tells me a great many things," he said finally, quietly, in the flat voice of a man reading a bill of sale rather than a confession. Charitable subscriptions, visits to sick friends, a fondness for the Marrowfield assemblies that has this summer become considerably more frequent than in any of the 6 summers before it. He paused. "I am not a stupid man, Mrs. Aldridge, whatever else tonight may suggest about my judgment. I have simply been, until recently, a very busy one." Eleanor said nothing. It was not her confession to receive, and she had learned, this summer above all others, the value of letting a silence do its own work. "There is a discrepancy in my own accounts," he said, "of some months' standing, that I had put down to a clerk's error. I no longer think it is a clerk's error." He turned, finally, to look at her directly, and there was nothing performed in it, none of the smoothness his wife wore like a second gown. "I think you and I may shortly have a great deal to discuss that has nothing to do with dancing." Behind them, the music turned, and Julian's laugh carried once across the room, bright and careless, the laugh of a man who had not yet noticed how much of the room had stopped watching him and started watching. Instead, the woman he had once called useful, standing very still at the window with the county's richest man beside her, both of them looking at something neither Julian nor Vivienne Rain had thought to guard. The discrepancy Gideon Rain had mentioned at the window turned out, once he laid it before Eleanor a week later in the small study at Combe Park, that Agatha had lent them for the purpose, to be considerably larger than a clerk's error, and considerably closer to home than either of them had first supposed. It was £210, drawn in 4 instalments since March against an account Vivienne Rain held nominal charge of for household and charitable expenses, each instalment noted in her own hand as a subscription to a fund for distressed clergy widows that turned out, when Gideon wrote discreetly to the diocese to confirm the fund's existence, not to exist at all. £210 is a great deal for a woman to spend on a fund that isn't real, Eleanor said, studying the ledger page he had brought. But it is not, forgive me, a fortune to a man of your means. Why does it trouble you enough to have crossed a ballroom over it? Because it isn't about the money, Gideon said. He sat across the small table with his hands folded, still, in the particular way of a man keeping them from doing something else. It is about what the money was for. I had a clerk trace the payments before I came to you. Each of the 4 instalments matches, almost to the day, a payment made from a separate account, your husband's account, Mrs. Aldridge, toward what is recorded there only as legal fees, Winslow matter. Eleanor went very still. I do not yet know what the Winslow matter is, Gideon said. I had rather hoped you might. She did know, or nearly. She went home that same evening and wrote to her father's old firm in Bath, the solicitors who had drawn her marriage settlement and held still the deed of trust protecting her £6,000 from any creditor of her husband's, a trust her father, cautious to the last, had structured so carefully that not even Julian himself could touch the principal without her signature and the firm's joint consent. The reply came back within the week, in the careful hand of Mr. Edmund Farrow, the junior partner who had inherited her father's caution along with his practice. There had been, Mr. Farrow wrote, an inquiry made in July, not by Eleanor, and not, on paper, by Julian either, though the letter requesting it had been written on Aldridge Hall stationery, and signed with a signature that was, Mr. Farrow noted with a solicitor's precision, not entirely consistent with Mr. Aldridge's hand as it appears on prior correspondence. The inquiry had asked whether the Winslow Trust could, under any circumstance, be dissolved or its principal advanced against an outstanding family debt, specifically an unpaid legal fee owed by the late Mr. Winslow's estate to a client whose name was given, in the letter, as a Mr. Josiah Calloway. There was no Josiah Calloway in her father's records. Mr. Farrow had checked, twice. Eleanor sat with the letter a long while, the ring turning slow between her fingers, and felt the whole shape of the summer rearrange itself around one plain fact. Someone had invented a debt, invented a client, and forged, or persuaded Julian to forge, or worse, persuaded Julian to believe was real enough to sign. A request to break open a trust her own dead father had built specifically to survive exactly this kind of hour, and the money drawn from Gideon Rain's household accounts, dressed as charity for widows who did not exist, had gone, if the dates matched, toward the legal costs of trying to open that trust from the outside, while Julian tried to open it from within. Not a debt, a door. Someone had been trying, patiently, all summer, to pry open the one thing her father had left specifically unbreakable, and to use another woman's husband's money to do it. She did not go to Julian first. She went, instead, back to Combe Park, and laid Mr. Farrow's letter beside Gideon's ledger page on the small table, and watched 2 separate paper trails converge into a single, ugly, coherent shape. She is not merely unfaithful, Eleanor said quietly. She is financing it, out of your money, to open my trust, so that whatever is left of my husband's mortgage debt can be cleared with my father's money instead of yours or his. And I expect, once it's cleared, she means for Julian to be a good deal more attractive a prospect than he currently is. Gideon's jaw worked once, the particular stillness of a man absorbing a blow he had already, on some level, been braced for since the ballroom. And what does she gain, he said, once my accounts have paid for prying open yours? I imagine, Eleanor said, that depends on whether she intends to still be your wife by Christmas. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Outside, the September wind moved through Combe Park's beech trees the way it moved every autumn. Indifferent to the two people inside, doing arithmetic, that would before the year was out cost a woman her marriage and a man his. I will not let her open that trust, Eleanor said finally. But I would rather not simply stop her. I would rather understand, fully, on paper, exactly what she has done, and let her be the one who explains it, in a room, to everyone who has spent this summer laughing at what my husband called me over pudding. Gideon looked at her for a long moment, something in his face recalibrating the way the counties had recalibrated all summer, degree by degree. Then we had better find the forged letter itself, he said, and Mr. Calloway's imaginary fee, and whatever else is sitting in a drawer somewhere, waiting to be found. I have a solicitor of my own in the city who is considerably less patient than yours, Mrs. Aldridge, and a good deal of motive. Now, to be thorough. Then we begin Monday, Eleanor said, and for the first time since the doorway in August, something in her chest that had been clenched all summer eased, fractionally, into the shape of a plan. The forged letter surfaced in October, not through any cleverness of Eleanor's, but through the ordinary, unglamorous mechanism of a bank clerk in Devizes, who remembered a face. Mr. Farrow's inquiries had established that the request to dissolve the Winslow Trust had been posted from Devizes, not Marrowfield, on the 11th of July, a Tuesday, the same Tuesday. Eleanor realised with a small cold jolt that Julian had been seen driving Vivienne Rain's phaeton through the town in broad daylight. Gideon's city solicitor, a brisk, unsentimental man named Mr. Pratt, who billed by the hour and wasted none of it, went to Devizes himself and showed the bank clerk there a sample of both Julian's hand and Vivienne's, taken discreetly from old correspondence, and asked which more closely matched the signature on the letter. The clerk did not hesitate. Neither, precisely, he said, though it favours the lady's more than the gentleman's, in the loop of the Y. But I recall the transaction itself well enough, sir, because it was the lady who came in with it, not the gentleman. Asked me to hold it for the afternoon post myself, rather than trust it to a servant. He paused. Handsome woman. Not one you forget. It was, Eleanor thought, when Mr. Pratt reported this back to her and Gideon together at Combe Park, very nearly enough on its own, but not quite public enough, and not quite total enough, to do what she required of it. A forged letter posted by a woman in a bank in Devizes was a private scandal, whispered over tea for a season, and then forgotten. She did not want it forgotten. She wanted it settled, in daylight, before the same 40 or so people who had watched her walk out of her own dining room over pudding. The vehicle for that arrived, conveniently, in the form of the parish's annual Michaelmas hearing, not a court in the full sense, but the quarterly gathering at which the parish's magistrate, Sir Walter Combe, heard boundary disputes, tenant grievances, and the settling of small local debts before the assembled vestry, a tradition old enough that half the county still attended out of habit rather than necessity. It was, Eleanor understood at once, exactly the room she needed, public, procedural, presided over by a man known for ruling on evidence rather than reputation, and already, by long custom, a place where paper was expected to be produced and read aloud. She wrote to Sir Walter herself, formally, requesting that the hearing's agenda include a matter concerning the disputed status of a trust held by the firm of Farrow and Sons on behalf of the Winslow family, and enclosed for his private review beforehand copies of Mr. Farrow's letter, the bank clerk's sworn statement, and Gideon's ledger page showing the matched payments. Sir Walter, who had told Agatha at the last assembly that Eleanor Aldridge would have made a better magistrate than half the men who sat his bench, wrote back within 2 days to say the matter would be heard on the 14th of October, and that he trusted Mrs. Aldridge would find the vestry's procedures thorough. She told Julian only the night before. She found him in the estate office, going over the very ledgers she herself had balanced every month for 6 years, and she set Mr. Farrow's letter on the desk in front of him, without preamble. "Someone tried to open my father's trust in July," she said, "using a debt that does not exist, owed to a client who does not exist, and a letter written on your stationery that a bank clerk in Devizes is prepared to swear was not delivered by you." Julian went very white, and then very still, in the particular way of a man watching a floor he had trusted give way beneath him one board at a time. "Eleanor, Sir Walter hears the matter tomorrow," she said. "I would rather you knew tonight than learn it standing in that room with everyone else." She paused at the door, her hand on the frame, and looked back at him, not with fury, which she had long since filed away minute by minute into the drawer at the back of her mind, but with something colder and more finished than fury. Something closer to a verdict already reached. "You told a man in a doorway that I keep the ledgers. That is what I am for." Her voice did not rise. "Tomorrow, Julian, the ledgers are going to keep you." She closed the door softly behind her, and did not wait to see his face. The vestry hall at Marrowfield was full by 10 the next morning, fuller than Eleanor had ever seen it for a Michaelmas hearing, because word had travelled the way it always travelled in that county, not loudly, but completely, the way water finds every low place at once. Sir Walter Combe sat at the long table at the front, with the parish clerk beside him, and the pews behind held, in rough order of arrival, most of the 40 people who had eaten pudding at Aldridge Hall in August. Eleanor sat near the front with Agatha on one side and, at a small distance that preserved every propriety while making his presence entirely unmistakable, Gideon Rain on the other. Julian sat alone, 3 rows back, his hands folded too tightly for a man who wished to appear composed. Vivienne Rain arrived last, in dark green, and took a seat near the door, close enough to leave quickly, Eleanor thought, if leaving became necessary. Sir Walter called the matter of the Winslow Trust with the flat procedural voice of a man who had heard 1,000 boundary disputes and intended to treat this one no differently, whatever the room's evident appetite for spectacle. "Mrs. Aldridge, you have brought a matter concerning an attempt, in July last, to dissolve a trust held for your benefit. You may state it." Eleanor stood. She did not raise her voice. In July, she said, a letter was sent from Devizes to the firm of Farrow and Sons, on Aldridge Hall stationery, requesting the dissolution of my late father's trust to satisfy a debt owed to a Mr. Josiah Calloway. No such debt exists in my father's records, no such client, so far as Farrow and Sons or I have been able to establish, has ever existed at all. She laid the letter on the table before Sir Walter. I have here the sworn statement of the bank clerk who received and posted that letter, describing the woman who delivered it to him personally, rather than trust it to a servant. She laid the second paper down. And I have here a ledger, kept by Mr. Gideon Rain, showing 4 payments made from his household accounts across the same months, each recorded as a subscription to a charity for clergy widows that the diocese confirms does not exist. Payments that match, almost to the day, the dates of legal inquiries made on my husband's behalf into breaking that same trust. The room had gone very quiet, the particular quiet of a crowd realizing, all at once, that it was about to witness something it would still be discussing at Christmas. "I do not believe my husband invented Mr. Calloway," Eleanor said. And here, for the first time, she allowed herself to look at Julian directly. "I believe he was persuaded a debt existed, and signed what he was told needed signing, by someone who understood him well enough to know he would rather solve a debt quietly than ask too many questions about where it came from." She turned back to Sir Walter. But the letter itself was not written or delivered by him. It was delivered by the clerk's own sworn description, by a woman answering precisely to Mrs. Rain's description, on a day my husband is independently known to have been in her company. Every head in the room turned, in the same unhurried, complete way water turns when a stone strikes it, toward Vivienne Rain near the door. She did not run. Eleanor would give her that, afterward, in the 10 minutes she still permitted herself for such reckonings. Vivienne Rain sat very straight, her chin level, and for one moment she and Eleanor might almost have been mirrors of each other, 2 women who had each spent a summer being underestimated. But where Eleanor had built, Vivienne had borrowed, and the difference showed now in the way her hands, gloved and still, could not quite keep from tightening in her lap. "This is a private family matter dressed up as theatre," Vivienne said, and her voice, for the first time all summer, did not arrive quite on cue. "It is a forged legal document," Sir Walter said mildly, "concerning a trust, presented before a vestry hearing at the trust holder's own request. I am afraid that makes it very much my business, madam, whatever else it may be." It was Thomas Reed who spoke next, unbidden, rising from a bench near the back where he had come. Eleanor understood only then, entirely on his own account, without her having asked. "Begging pardon, Sir Walter," he said, "but I've nothing to do with trusts nor ledgers of that kind. I only know Mrs. Aldridge herself paid for the sluice gate at Hollow Mead out of her own pin money this summer, when her husband hadn't the ready cash to spare for it, and sold her own earrings to make up the difference. A woman minding her tenants' flooded fields on her own coin isn't a woman scheming to break open a trust for want of money, Sir Walter. She's the only one in this room who's shown she doesn't need to." A murmur went through the pews, not loud, never loud, but complete, the particular sound of a county's opinion finishing a turn it had been making all summer. Sir Walter allowed it a moment before he raised one hand, and the room quieted. "Mrs. Rain," he said, "have you anything to say regarding the delivery of this letter to the bank at Devizes on the 11th of July?" Vivienne Rainey looked for one long moment at Julian, who did not look back at her, and then at Gideon, whose face gave her nothing at all, and then, finally, at Eleanor, and something behind her composure, not the composure itself, but whatever had been propping it up all summer, visibly went out, like a candle starved rather than blown. "I delivered a letter," she said at last, very quietly. "I do not deny it was mine to deliver." Sir Walter made a note. "Then the trust stands undissolved and unmolested," he said, "as it was always going to, given the settlement's own terms, which I have reviewed and find sound. Whatever further matters arise from this admission between the parties concerned are, I think, rather beyond a Michaelmas hearing's authority to settle. But the letter itself and its author are now a matter of parish record." He looked up, over his spectacles, at the room rather than at any one person in it. I would remind everyone present that a forged signature is not a small matter, merely because no money was ultimately lost. It very nearly was. It was prevented only because a trust was built carefully enough, some years ago, by a father who did not live to see it tested, and because his daughter kept her own records well enough to notice the attempt at all. He closed the folder. The hearing moved on to a boundary dispute concerning a hedge 2 farms over, and the room's attention did not. Eleanor did not look at Julian as she gathered her papers. She did not need to. She could feel, without looking, the particular weight of 40 people no longer laughing, and for the first time in longer than she could reasonably count, it did not feel like a burden at all. Gideon Rain did not have his own accounting to give in front of the vestry. His wife's borrowing of his money was, as Sir Walter had said, beyond a parish hearing's authority. But he gave it that same evening, in the small study at Combe Park, with only Eleanor and Agatha present, because Eleanor had asked him plainly whether he meant to explain himself, or merely to apologise, and he had said he preferred, if she would allow it, to do both properly rather than either badly. "I married Vivienne 8 years ago," he said, "for reasons that were, on my side at least, closer to arithmetic than affection, a sensible match between 2 families who understood commerce. I do not say that to excuse what came after. I say it because I have spent this autumn realising that a marriage begun as arithmetic tends to stay arithmetic on both sides. Unless someone troubles to make it something else, and I never troubled." He turned his hat once in his hands, the small unconscious gesture of a man who had, Eleanor thought, very few nervous habits and had just discovered one. "I was away a great deal. Trade does not run itself, and I let it run me instead, and told myself that providing generously for a marriage was the same as attending to it. It is not. I understand that a good deal more clearly now than I did in July. That is an explanation," Eleanor said. "It is not yet an apology." "No," Gideon agreed. "The apology is this. I am sorry that my absence made it easy for her to look elsewhere, and easier still for her to spend my money doing it, and I am sorry that the first time I truly saw you, not the running of an estate, which I admired within a week of hearing of it, but you, specifically unhappy in a room full of people who did not deserve your composure. I saw it because my own house was already on fire, and yours had just caught the same spark." He looked at her directly. "I do not ask you to feel anything about that tonight. I ask only that you allow me to be useful to you in whatever comes next. Not because you require rescuing, Mrs. Aldridge. You have made amply clear this autumn that you do not, but because I find I would like to be, and have not felt that particular wish in some years." Eleanor considered him for a long moment, turning her mother's ring once around her finger. "Useful," she said, "is a word I have grown careful of this year. Missa Rain, then I withdraw it," he said, without hesitation, "and offer instead only this. I would like to know you better, on whatever terms you find fair, once both our households have finished being untangled. I am not asking for anything tonight beyond your permission to ask again, properly, when it is not indecent to do so." "That," Agatha said from her chair by the fire, not looking up from her needlework, "is the first sensible thing either of you has said all evening." Eleanor found, to her own mild surprise, that she was very nearly smiling. Julian's own accounting came 4 days later in the estate office at Aldridge Hall, where Eleanor had asked him to meet her because it was, she had decided, the one room in the house that had always been more honestly hers than his. "I did not know Calloway didn't exist," he said, without preamble, standing rather than sitting. his hands loose at his sides, in a way that looked, for once, less like carelessness than genuine helplessness. She told me there was an old debt. She told me it could be settled quietly, from your trust, without troubling you, and that it would clear the mortgage faster than the harvest could. I wanted the mortgage cleared. I have wanted it cleared since my father died, and I watched him explain, one tenant at a time, standing at his own front door, that a man he had trusted had ruined him. I swore I would never be that man, standing at a door explaining ruin. I swore it so hard I stopped noticing I was becoming. Instead, a man who would sign nearly anything a confident voice put in front of him, so long as it promised to keep the ruin away. He stopped, started again. That is not an excuse. I know it is not an excuse. It is only the truth, which you are, I think, the one person in this county who has ever actually wanted from me. I distinguish, Eleanor said, between an apology and an explanation, Julian. You have just given me an explanation. It is a real one, and I do not dismiss it. But I have not yet heard you say the other thing. He was quiet a moment. I am sorry, he said finally, and his voice broke slightly on the second word. The sound of a man discovering the sentence cost more than he had budgeted for it. I am sorry I called you useful in a doorway, as though 6 years of you were a ledger entry. I am sorry it took losing the county's good opinion of me to notice I had already lost yours, some years before that, and never troubled to ask when. He looked at her. I do not expect you to want me back. I would like, if it is not presumptuous, to know what you do want, so that I might at least stop guessing wrong about you as a final courtesy. Eleanor had in fact spent the 4 days since the hearing writing the answer to that question, in the same private ledger where she had once written Vivienne Rain. Old debt? Watch? And she recited it now the way she recited any accounting, plainly, without ornament. I want the trust left exactly as my father built it, untouched, for the rest of my life, she said. I want the estate's accounts kept in both our names from this day, not merely managed by me and signed by you. I want Thomas Reed's wages, and every tenant's, reviewed and raised to a fair rate by Michaelmas next, as proof this house's economy runs on more than what it can extract from people too poor to argue. I want it understood, publicly, that whatever separation the law allows us, I remain mistress of this house's daily governance for as long as I choose to be, regardless of what becomes of the marriage itself. And I want you to stop being surprised every time I do something competent, as though competence were a trick I had only just learned rather than a thing I have been doing, unwitnessed, for 6 years. Julian nodded slowly, and something in his face, Eleanor thought, looked almost like relief, the particular relief of a man finally handed terms plain enough that he no longer had to guess at the shape of what he owed. "All right," he said. "All right, then," Eleanor said. And that, for the present, was the whole of the treaty between them. Autumn gave way to a wary winter, and the wariness, slowly, gave way to something that resembled ordinary days. Eleanor did not return to Julian's bed, nor to the pretence of a marriage neither of them any longer had the heart to perform for the county's benefit. A formal deed of separation was drawn by Mr. Farrow before Christmas, generous to Eleanor by any measure, and Julian signed it without argument, in the same estate office, at the same desk, with a steadiness that suggested he had finally stopped fighting the accounting, and started, instead, paying it. Vivienne Rain left the county before the first snow, for a sister's house in the north, and was not spoken of again in any voice Eleanor troubled to listen to. Gideon settled matters with his own solicitors quietly and without cruelty, providing for her separately, dignified in exile rather than punished in public. which was, Eleanor thought, exactly the mercy a man who had once loved her, however badly, could still afford to grant. What grew instead, through that winter and into the spring that followed, was smaller than a courtship, and larger than mere acquaintance. Gideon Rain came to Aldridge Hall first about drainage, a genuine question, about whether Hollowmead's sluicegate design might answer for flooding on one of his own tenanted farms 2 counties over, and stayed to tea, and came again the following week about nothing in particular, and by February had fallen into the habit of arriving on Thursdays with no pretext offered at all, simply the plain statement that he had found himself in the neighbourhood and wondered whether she was at leisure. She noticed, because she had spent a lifetime noticing what other people missed, the particular accumulation of it, the chair he began, without remark, to move beside hers rather than across from her. The tea he learned, by March, to pour for her unasked, exactly as she liked it, having watched her make it for herself perhaps 4 times. The ledger of his own northern properties he began, by April, to bring and lay open beside hers, not to impress her with the scale of it, but because he had discovered, he admitted once, that he thought more clearly with her opinion in the room. None of it, on its own, meant anything at all. All of it, together, meant everything, and Eleanor found she no longer distrusted a thing simply because it accumulated slowly. There was one relapse, in May, that she noted and did not let pass. Gideon, hearing that a tenant dispute had arisen on one of his own farms, rode out and settled it himself in a single afternoon, without troubling to send word or ask her thoughts, exactly as he would have done a year earlier, before he had learned any better habit. He told her of it proudly that evening, expecting praise, and found instead that she set down her cup with both hands, carefully, and looked at him steadily. "You did not ask me," she said, "not because you needed my permission. Because you have spent 6 years training yourself to solve things alone and tell people after. And I would like to know whether that is a fixed part of you, or a habit you are willing to unlearn a second time. For me specifically." He was quiet a long moment, and she watched him do visibly the work of not defending himself. "It is a habit," he said finally. "I will do better. Not because you have asked it once, but because I intend to keep asking myself the same question long after you have stopped needing to ask it for me." He did do better. By June he had begun, without prompting, to write her first about any decision touching land she knew. And she found, turning her mother's ring one evening on the terrace, while he read aloud some dry clause from a lease he wanted her opinion of, that she had stopped counting the minutes she allowed herself for anything at all. Because there was, increasingly, nothing left in her days that required rationing. It was on a Thursday in late June, on that same terrace, with the light going long and gold the way it had the September evening she'd driven home from Combe Park, doing arithmetic on her own worth, that Gideon Rain set down the lease entirely and turned to her instead. "I have spent the better part of a year," he said, "learning the difference between being useful to a house and being wanted in it. I find I would like, for the whole of whatever life remains to me, to be the second thing to you, and never again mistaken for the first." He paused, and there was for once nothing smooth in his voice at all, only plainness. "I would choose you, Eleanor. I have been choosing you, in fact, since a night in October when you stood in a vestry hall, and would not let a lie stand simply because it was easier to let it. I expect I will go on choosing you for as long as you'll permit it." "That is not quite a question," Eleanor said, though her voice, for the first time in longer than she could remember, was not entirely steady either. No, he agreed, and reached into his coat and set on the table between them a small ring, a single deep-set stone, plain rather than showy, chosen, he told her later, specifically because it would not outshine the garnet she already wore and clearly had no intention of ever removing. I did not want to ask it as a question you might feel obliged to answer kindly. I wanted to lay the fact of it before you, the way you laid a letter before a magistrate once, and let you decide, in your own time, what you meant to do with the evidence. Eleanor looked at the ring a long moment, and then at her mother's garnet, small and plain and permanent on her other hand, and thought of a doorway in August, and a sentence that had once tried to make the whole of her worth fit inside 4 words. She keeps the ledgers. That's what she's for. She keeps a great deal more than ledgers, she said aloud, half to herself, and Gideon, watching her, answered it anyway, quietly, as though he had been waiting a year for the chance. She keeps everything upright, he said. That was never what she was for. That is only who she is. Eleanor picked up the ring and put it on, and did not take 10 minutes, nor even 1, to decide that she meant it. 2 years later, Aldridge Hall's roof was entirely sound. Its tenants paid a rate that Thomas Reed himself had helped set at a second, friendlier hearing, and Hollowmead's sluice gate, still holding, had become the pattern for 3 other farms across 2 counties. Eleanor Raine, for she had taken the name, in the end, without ceremony, the way she took on any fact once she had satisfied herself it was true, kept the accounts of both households now, in a single ledger, in her own hand, and no one who watched her do it any longer mistook the doing of it for anything less than what it was. Julian Aldridge had married again, quietly, a widow of modest means and plainer expectations, and was said, by those who still troubled to report on him, to have become a careful and rather unremarkable husband, a man who had learned, at considerable cost, exactly how much a doorway sentence could take from a life, and had apparently resolved never to speak so carelessly in one again. He and Eleanor exchanged, once a year, a brief and entirely civil letter concerning the trust's continued good order, and nothing more, and both of them, by unspoken agreement, seemed content that nothing more was needed. The garnet ring Eleanor still wore, turned now beside a plainer, deeper stone that had once sat on a terrace table like evidence laid before a jury. She had told the story of both rings only once, to a niece of Gideon's who asked, one Christmas, why she wore 2 so different rings on the same hand, and had said only that one was for what she had been born with, and the other was for what she had built, and that a woman ought never let anyone convince her the second sort mattered less than the first, merely because it arrived later and cost more, and was chosen rather than inherited. Aldridge Hall, in its own quiet way, had begun to breathe again too. In the years since a summer dinner over pudding, the west wing's roof finally mended properly rather than patched, the tenant cottages sound against the winter, a house no longer holding still against a coldness at its centre, but going about its ordinary business in ordinary daylight, the way a house does when no one inside it is any longer waiting for a verdict. She had stopped asking to be seen. She had made herself, instead, impossible to overlook, one flooded field and one honest ledger at a time, not because she had set out that summer to punish anyone, but because the only answer she had ever known to being called useful instead of loved was to become. Patiently and without a single raised voice, undeniable, not because she needed the county's good opinion, though she had it, not because she needed a second husband's ring, though she wore it gladly, but because a woman who has once been classified as an asset owes it to herself, and to no one else, to become the kind of asset no honest accounting can ever again mistake for anything less than everything. That was not a thing that could be taken from her twice.